We just made an executive decision, and tonight, rather than having Bill McGurn address us, we're inviting in an Elvis impersonator. No, you're in for a delight tonight. I have known Bill, just as I was going through the curriculum vitae, it dawned on me that I have known Bill McGurn in almost all of his incarnations, professional incarnations. We met many years ago. I don't know if any of you remember the magazine or the journal called The World. Bill was writing for that, and the editor at the time was, as I recall, Michael Scully, who died much too young. And we had a delightful meeting in New York, and then we visited again, as I recall, in Hong Kong, where he was the editor of the editorial page of the Asian Wall Street Journal. We've met any number of times in all kinds of interesting places, and I want to tell you, this man is a high-class gossip. I mean, just from that period of time in the White House, I had the pleasure also, how does this all kind of revolve around food as I think about this? We had lunch in the mess at the White House when he worked as a speechwriter for President Bush, George W. Bush, and was living, not watching on television, but living virtually in the West Wing. And he is a journalist par excellence. You probably know him from his days at the Wall Street Journal in Asia, in Europe, in New York, but also now he is kind of running his own shop, so to speak. He had done a stint for the president of the News Corporation, and presently now he is the editor of the New York Post. Now, there's one regrettable flaw in this otherwise impeccable pedigree, and that is that he is a graduate of Notre Dame and studied under the Jesuits in Boston. So I have a special apostolic authority tonight, delegated to me via fax from Rome, to give, under this unusual circumstance, a general absolution to all of you Notre Dame folks in the room and others who have been inflicted by various kinds of Jesuits and other pestilences. No, I joke. We have a Pope who's a Jesuit. Holy Father, if you're listening, if the Vatican NSA is listening, mea maxima culpa. So please welcome tonight my good friend, Bill McGurn.
Thanks, Father, although you did really make it sound like I couldn't keep a job. I'll tell you about my Italian side, Father. When I worked with President Bush, we went to the Vatican to meet the Pope, Pope Benedict at the time. And the senior staff was with him, and on an official visit, the way it works is that the president goes around and introduces you to whatever leader he's meeting. And so I was in line, the president was talking with Pope Benedict, and we went up to meet him. And I had practiced in the morning at the hotel. I had asked the concierge, how do you say, I'm honored to meet you, Holy Father, something like that, something very simple, and I'd been practicing it all day. So when I went up there, I had to also decide, I was an official member of a US delegation, whether I kissed the Pope's ring, whether it's fitting for some. I was a Catholic, but on the other hand, I'm there in my capacity as a member of the Bush administration. So as I'm thinking of that, I thought, you know, in my job, I've had to kiss a lot So I did kiss the Pope's ring, very grateful, and I delivered my one line. And the Pope said to me in English, he said, "Your Italian is flawless." Behind me in line was the First Lady's Chief of Staff, Anita McBride. Anita's maiden name is Anita Bevilacqua. She grew up speaking Italian as her first language, and she had a whole spiel that she gave to the Pope in Italian. And then she complained to me. She said the Pope hadn't told her that her Italian was good. And I said to Anita, Anita, I only know two things. The Pope is infallible, and he told me my Italian was flawless. And ever since then, when I email Anita, I write my words out in English, and I go to Babelfish, and I translate them into Italian, and I send it back, and she can never figure out how I can do this so quickly. So anyway, I want to say this is my first time at Acton U, and I'm just amazed by what an extraordinary crowd this is. You come from different faiths and different traditions. I'm told you come from 80 different countries, not to mention many different parts of this country. And now you're gathering here in a 21st century Midwestern American city under the banner of a 19th century English Catholic who rose to prominence in a Protestant nation because of his penetrating insights into the binding social beauty of liberty. So you're an ecumenical audience, and in that way you remind me of a story. It's about an Irish priest who's awakened in the middle of the night by an unholy racket he hears outside his bedroom window. Father gets out of bed, grabs a flashlight, and goes out to see what's going on. There he sees a man sprawled out on his garbage cans, and he recognizes him as one of his parishioners. Father asks the man, "Paddy, whatever are you doing here this hour of the night?" The man replies, "Father, we need to have a talk about the challenge of ecumenism." Father looks at him and says, "Paddy, it's 3 in the morning." Paddy says, "Father, I wouldn't be bothering you, except it's being of the utmost importance. Ecumenism is the challenge of our times." So Father says, "Tell you what, be a good lad. Go home, get a good night's sleep. When you wake up in the morning, take a long shower, and then drop by for a nice cup of tea, and we'll have a good long chat about the challenge of ecumenism." Paddy looks at him again and says, "Father, you don't understand at all. When I'm sober, I don't give a damn about ecumenism." Father Sirico, Chris Moran, Sam Gregg, all the Acton faculty, fellows, and friends, all kidding aside, I do have a serious point about ecumenism. The motto of the United States is E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Too often this is a platitude, but in this room we can see whence comes the unum. It comes from truth. In the case of this university, it's the truth about human nature and consequently of human dignity that also serves as the foundation of American liberty. This university's class on Christian anthropology speaks to that understanding. The sense that I'm using it is a little more limited, and I would say even narrowing it to Christian anthropology might be a misunderstanding, given that its core, this understanding that I refer to, originally comes from the Jews, and that many outside the Judeo-Christian tradition also assent implicitly or otherwise to this anthropology. By Christian anthropology, I mean an appreciation that we possess dignity because each one of us bears the image and likeness of our Creator. America's Declaration of Independence asserts this Creator has fitted us for liberty. And we can see that too, especially when we define liberty the way Lord Acton and Father Sirico do, not as the freedom to do as we please, but the liberty to do as we ought. In our world, and especially in our world's headlines and in my business, religion has become shorthand for irreconcilable conflict or irrational opposition to science. The merry band at Acton has a very different view. They're making their bet on you. And their bet is that there exists no more vital Christian witness in our world today than the truth about human nature and the liberty for which all men and women have been fashioned. Your presence here attests to the power and the glory of that message. You come in goodwill. You seek to strengthen the bonds between our faiths and traditions. And by carrying the truth about life and liberty into the public square, you endeavor to help man realize his God-given destiny and leave our world better than you found it. My friends, we all know that this good work is its own reward, but we also know that there's grace in a simple thank you. So before we go any further, I ask you to join me in showing our appreciation for a small institute that makes a huge impact, the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. Tonight, I should like to speak about an area close to the heart of the Acton Institute, the way to unlock human potential and free hundreds of millions mired in poverty so they can build a more hopeful future for themselves, for their families, for their communities, and for their nations. One of the crazier things about our world is that the system that has over and over and over proved its ability to do just that across all cultures and all traditions is the same system most under intellectual siege today. It is under siege from people who say it's based on greed, from people who say it rewards only the wealthy, from people who trust government because they absolutely do not trust the private sector. In essence, these objections are all different ways of expressing the same thing. Capitalism is anti-human. If we are honest with ourselves, we will admit that often the loudest voices echoing this objection are religious voices. And I have learned from experience that those who make these arguments are just as often not open to evidence that suggests otherwise. That's because there's something deeper and more organic about their denunciations, a fundamental misgiving that the whole of capitalism is intrinsically disordered, even when they might bring themselves to acknowledge that, yes, capitalist China has done a lot better by its poor than communist China ever did. They somehow conclude that this is a tragedy of communism and not a triumph of capitalism. I believe it's because they think that while freer markets might well make a society more productive and wealthy, the price is turning human beings into commodities and human relations into a dog-eat-dog contest for domination. So today, I wish to talk to you about the humanity of capitalism. I wish to talk about the place that I experienced that humanity most vividly in Hong Kong. I chose Hong Kong not simply because I lived there for nearly a decade. I chose it because Hong Kong works. It's successful, and its people are better off for it. And I wish to talk about the largely unheralded man whom I hold most responsible for making Hong Kong so, Sir John James Cowperthwaite. In particular, I wish to speak about three aspects of the Hong Kong that I knew and loved and lived in for nearly 10 years that ought to have special resonance for Christians. First, that as a market society, it was welcoming to people, seeing them as assets and not liabilities. Second, the humanizing role of competition upon society. And third, the way religious organizations have flourished in Hong Kong and play a vital role in its daily life. Let me begin with Mr. Cowperthwaite. When I was a much younger reporter starting out in Hong Kong, I once rang up government information services for what I thought would be a routine piece of information, Hong Kong's gross domestic product for 1963. I had hoped to use the number to show how much Hong Kong's economy had grown since then. But a funny thing happened. The chap on the other end of the line told me he couldn't give me the number. And he told me he couldn't give it to me because he didn't have the number. and he didn't have the number because of John James Cowperthwaite. At the time, the name meant nothing to me. Presently, I learned that Cowperthwaite had been Hong Kong's financial secretary from 1961 to 1971 and had in fact overseen Hong Kong's economic policy for years before that. I learned too that during his tenure as financial secretary, industrial wages in Hong Kong doubled, exports grew by an average 13.8% each year, and the percentage of Hong Kong households in acute poverty shrunk from half to 16%. Like Adam Smith, Cowperthwaite was a Scot. He was posted to Hong Kong just 3 months after Hirohito's surrender. When he arrived, he landed in a colony raw from the privations owing to the war and years of brutal Japanese rule. But Cowperthwaite saw something else. He saw that the people of Hong Kong were already recovering rather smartly without him. That instinct that ordinary people could do quite well without bureaucrats, and that financial secretaries ought thereby to be guided by modesty, would prove invaluable for Hong Kong. It would prove especially invaluable for the hundreds of thousands of desperate Chinese refugees who more than doubled the population in the 1950s after the red flag went up over China. These people came by plane, by train, and by boat. Some even swam through shark-infested waters. But mostly they came on foot, and they lived anywhere they could, in the streets, under trees, on the hills, in squalid homes that were little more than a few square feet of old wooden boards and tin. People thought Hong Kong would be overwhelmed. An American newspaper pronounced the city dead. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees advised that Hong Kong simply could not survive with all those refugees. And the general view was that the colony's carrying capacity was somewhere about 1.2 million people. In its 1957 annual report, the Hong Kong government reflected the sense of doom and desperation in a bleak lead chapter entitled, quote, "A Problem of People." As it turned out, China's fall would prove Hong Kong's gain. For while these refugees brought no money, they did bring something more precious: skills, know-how, and a willingness to work. In almost no time, they proved the impetus for Hong Kong's first wave of industrialization. Not only did Hong Kong survive, it blossomed, and it did so despite the severe blow dealt by the loss overnight of its largest market, China, to the UN trade embargo. To its great credit, only 3 years after the government wrote A Problem of People, it reversed itself, saying that the new arrivals had in fact, quote, laid the foundation for a rapidly developing industrialization. Hong Kong's ability to absorb so many people in such a short time owed something to Cowperthwaite's philosophy. Not that the government did nothing. When a Christmas Day fire in 1953 left thousands of people suddenly homeless, Hong Kong embarked on what would become a huge program for public housing. But its interventions were few, and its ability to afford them was in large part because Cowperthwaite had been such a good and stingy guardian of the public purse. Meanwhile, the ability of these refugees to find work and build enterprises was largely because of the open economic climate that Cowperthwaite had nourished and fostered, to the point where a poor colony that was thought to have a carrying capacity of 1.2 million people is now a wealthy society of more than 7 million people. Not that he would put it that way. In an explanation that comports with the Presbyterian modesty of his native Scotland, he liked to explain his role this way, quote, "I did very little. All I did was try to prevent some of the things that might undo it." Think about that. We're often lectured about how cold and uncaring and inhuman capitalism is. But if you were a desperate family trying to make a life for yourselves, where would you want to live? As the world's most capitalistic society, Hong Kong recognizes that its most precious resource is the human mind. So it's only natural that it should take a more the merrier approach to people. In our day, the recognition that people are the ultimate resource is insufficiently appreciated. But there is another crucial aspect of Cowperthwaite's gospel that is also unappreciated: the humanizing role of market competition. No other aspect of the free market provokes more hostility than the idea of competition. In theory, market competition sets us all against our neighbors. In practice, as I found in Hong Kong, market competition gentles us and makes us more accommodating to our neighbors. It's not so strange when you think about it. Usually when we think about competition, we think of a zero-sum contest where one side wins and everyone else loses. It could be war, or it could be a boxing match. But competition in a market based on voluntary exchange is different from this other kind of competition. What makes it different is the presence of a third party. In market competition, the competitors are not only competing against one another, they're competing for a buyer. Now, the relationship between buyer and seller that Cowperthwaite recognized and promoted is not the love of neighbor commanded by the gospel. But neither is it as far removed as we might think. Because of the competition for our patronage, in the market, we expect to be treated decently. It explains the saying, the customer is always right. Just compare that with, say, how you expect to be treated at your local division of motor vehicles or the IRS, and you'll see the difference. Yes, there are scoundrels trying to shortchange us in the free market, and you can get very bad service even in the freest of markets. But if you don't like the food or are treated rudely, you don't have to go back. There are plenty other restaurants and other services that will try to please you. It also works the same way for labor. If you were looking for work, would you want dozens of employers competing to hire you, or just one? And if you're working for someone, doesn't it help if the economy is producing so many jobs that you're not stuck there? Because the best guarantee of good treatment from a boss is that you can leave. It's his knowledge that you can leave and get a good job elsewhere if he does not treat you right. In our universities, we're often taught that this competition is wasteful, and that the opposite of competition is cooperation, and that's the model that we should be pursuing. But nothing could be farther from the truth. As Adam Smith himself recognized, when governments cooperate with business, the people generally suffer. I call it McGurn's first law. It runs as follows: the opposite of market competition is not cooperation, it's collusion. That leads me to the last aspect of the Cowperthwaite Society, the way churches and like organizations thrive and prosper. Encouraging churches, of course, does not appear on the job description of any financial secretary. But if you are going to keep government small, you will find yourself depending on private organizations. That is why in Hong Kong, which is not a particularly religious or particularly Christian society, religious organizations loom large, and Christians in particular play a strong social role. When I lived in Hong Kong, for example, Caritas, for Catholic Charities, was the largest social welfare organization in the colony. The Catholic Church, though less than 5% of the population, runs hospitals, schools, retirement homes, hostels, and other welfare services that serve about 2.5 million people each year. It's about a third of the population. So when my wife and I were looking to adopt, we went to Catholic Charities. We did this not because we were Catholic, but because the organization had such good influence with China, which sought to learn from its example. The Catholic Church is not the only one. Most of you here, I believe, are Protestant. A glance at the city's Protestant community in Hong Kong's most recent annual report lists 70 different denominations with 1,400 congregations. The Hong Kong annual report puts it this way, quote, "The Protestant community runs 3 post-secondary institutions, the Chung Chi College of Chinese University of Hong Kong, Hong Kong Baptist University, and Lingnan University. It also runs more than 639 schools, 260 kindergartens, 199 primary schools, and 180 secondary schools, and 127 nurseries. In addition, it operates more than 35 theological schools, 81 Christian publishing houses, and 114 Christian bookstores. There are 53 media, audiovisual production, and arts groups, such as 2 Christian weekly newspapers, the Christian Times and Christian Weekly, which present news and comments from a Christian perspective, Christian media agencies which broadcast Christian TV programs regularly, and 4 weekly Christian radio programs on Radio Television Hong Kong. Goes on to say, the Protestant community runs 7 hospitals and 17 clinics. A total of 107 multi-social centers provides a wide range of services at more than 109 community family youth services, 11 children homes, 169 elderly services and centers, nursing homes, 59 rehabilitation centers for mentally handicapped, disabled, and drug addicts. There are at least 50 hospital chaplaincies, 1 airport chaplaincy, and 3 prison chaplaincies, and 23 campsites. The Chinese Young Men's Christian Association of Hong Kong and the Hong Kong Young Women's Christian Association together manage 5 international hotel-style guest houses. One last thing. When we talk about the work of these churches, we do well to remember we are talking about a minority religion in a society where the majority of people say they don't follow any religion. Christianity accounts for only 12% of Hong Kong's population, but the freedom of its market economy gives these Christian institutions a profound role in society, along with the work of similar organizations run by Buddhists, Hindus, Taoists, Muslims, Jews, Sikhs, and so on. In short, the Cowperthwaite Society not only tolerates these churches and institutions, it depends on them in a way that government societies do not. When these organizations are free, they flourish and act as a humanizing influence. If you believe, as I do, that these groups serve the needy better than a government bureaucracy, you can see why they're so appreciated. My friends, I've gone on long enough. Let me close. Some of you, no doubt, have seen the film Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. The title is a reference to a Chinese proverb. It means that though people may look ordinary, lurking underneath are extraordinary powers and talents. It strikes me as not a bad metaphor for how the market looks at people, how Christianity looks at people, and how John James Cowperthwaite could see in the struggling population of a war-weary city a people who would prosper beyond their dreams if only nobody got in their way. It has been put to me that Cowperthwaite himself would never take the credit I herewith give him for Hong Kong. He would likely regard it as an accident of history, a pocket of freedom that arose because of unique circumstances, British colonialism and Chinese communism. He might have been skeptical about how difficult it would be to maintain a Cowperthwaitian society in a democratic country such as England or the United States, where politicians too often compete for votes by offering people more and more goodies from the public purse. And I'm certain he would find it baffling to find any theological underpinning for what he mostly regarded as common sense, a faith in the ability of good people to look out for themselves, and a profound distrust of the idea that any bureaucrat could do better. So let me give you the ending about those missing figures I mentioned at the beginning. Many years after Sir John had left office, and only a few years before he passed away, I finally had a chance to meet the man. We met at the Mandarin Hotel, a Hong Kong landmark whose restaurant had been designed by his architect's son. And there over lunch, I asked him the question I had wanted to for so long. Why on earth did you not let the government officials collect statistics? If I had, he answered, they would only have misused them. My friends, if we Christians had as much skepticism toward bureaucrats who believe they know best, and as much faith in what ordinary people can accomplish, if only given the liberty to do so, we could move mountains. Thanks to the Acton Institute for having me, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Bill. We have some time for questions. So there are going to be the 3 roving microphones, and I need you to get my attention. And if you'd raise your hands and get the attention of one of these microphones. Okay.
Yes, I enjoyed the presentation. Reverend Elijah Hill from Arlington, Texas. I was wanting to just get your feedback from the standpoint of, when you look at scholarly, material when it comes to the East, they really talk about how in America we ended up needing what they were doing with leadership and the servant leadership perspective. And can you expound on that in the sense of their culture and how in America later on in the business community, they needed that model?
I think the model is freedom. Nowadays it's popular to say Asian culture is superior and Confucian society or something, but it's really the same thing that made us rich, the market. If you go back 60 years ago, you'd find all the experts saying that Confucianism was keeping China down. This is one of the things that I find maddening about a lot of the scholarship. We have clear evidence that when you liberalize, whether it's in China, which is not still entirely free, but has certainly liberalized the economy, when you liberalize, good things happen. And it doesn't matter whether that's post-war Japan, modern China, the United States, any place you pick. And yet we all then try to find excuses why it's just for this unique culture. Sometimes that seems a way to me of people trying to suggest that it won't work somewhere else. And I think that, especially if you have a Christian view, that we have a certain human nature, that we were made for liberty. If we were made for liberty, it shouldn't be that surprising that we prosper best when we're the most free. And so I'm very skeptical about cultural arguments. I mean, some cultures, yes, will do more. The kind of flavor of the capitalism will be different, and what they, whether they go for big, gigantic firms like Japan and Korea, or more mom and pop things like Hong Kong and Taiwan. But I think, look, what unifies them is freedom. You go to Hong Kong and try to start up a business, you could start it up in one afternoon. It's just so much easier. In the New York where I live now, small businesses are fined every day. And they're fined not because they have a health violation, they're fined by the health department because they need revenue. It's like a third world country. So I'm very skeptical of the cultural argument. I think there are cultural ingredients. I think also one of the things is their families are generally more intact. They have less dependency. But basically they've had very small welfare states. And the reason China opened up is that it couldn't afford the kind of welfare state that it had.
Another question over here?
Yes, good evening. When I was living in Tokyo, I had the opportunity to visit Hong Kong, and it certainly is a bustling and dynamic place. I have a couple of questions for you, though. Do you believe that they will be able to continue to maintain that level of freedom and dynamism now that they are under the aegis of the People's Republic? And the other question I have is, can we believe any economic numbers that come out of China? The reason I ask that question is I remember one year when I was living in Tokyo, that on December 31st of that year, the Chinese released their GDP growth figure for that year. And the only way they could have done that was if they knew it on January 1st of that, they had to have made it up. So, please.
That's the question on everyone's mind. First, I'll give you the simple overview answer. You know, my view, especially in 1997, I was there when Hong Kong was handed over. It was an international, modern, financial world capital. So Hong Kong was up here in terms of its sophistication, its wealth, and so forth. China was opening up, but China was down there. And China's moved up a lot since then to maybe about here. It's a lot easier for China to move up. I'm more confident about China in a way to move up than for Hong Kong to maintain its place here. And they've already slipped in a few things. I mean, I think when societies get wealthy, they tend to start looking for security, and they've invested in industrial parks, which they never did. They have, I mean, again, it's a matter of comparison. They have a social security kind of program, a pension scheme, which if we adapted it would be a great reform of our pension scheme, but it's sort of a step down for Hong Kong. The biggest threat to Hong Kong is, and what makes China different from other communist societies. I mean, China's a lot freer than people think in the economic realm over here. It's not the classic communist society like the Soviet Union. What makes it different is there's a lot of money to be made in China, an awful lot of money. There's always been the dream of, you know, selling every Chinese a Coca-Cola. If you read the books for 1933, it used to be sell every Chinese an apple. I mean, it's the same argument. So there's a lot of money there, and that's where a lot of people are making their money, and even the Hong Kong people, a lot of the businessmen, they have their factories in China, and they don't want to criticize. So I'm skeptical about Hong Kong's ability. It's done better than I thought. It's been more independent than I thought. But it's just, even without bad will, China has so much corruption coming over. It's just hard. You know, if you had a beautiful house in a neighborhood that's going down, it's just hard. I mean, the neighborhood's sort of going up, but they're coming into your neighborhood. So I don't think Hong Kong was quite the place it was 40 years ago, but it's still a lot better than most of the, you know, it's still way up here. So again, in the long term, I think it's easier for China to move up because they're still so heavy-handed in some areas. So it's easier for them to liberalize than it is for Hong Kong to maintain its system, which, let's face it, if you want to talk about culture, the British rule of law, an honest civil service, and the rule of law, that's what allowed those people to flourish. That is a little harder to do, you know, with so much in China based on connections and so forth.
I'm Dr. Jennifer Roback-Morse. I'm one of the Acton faculty, and I too have visited briefly in Hong Kong, and I share your admiration for the place and for the important role that economic freedom has played in making it what it is. I have a concern, a different kind of concern about Hong Kong, which is what I would consider a catastrophically low birth rate. The total fertility rate in Hong Kong is 1.11 babies per woman, which is the 4th lowest in the world. And I wondered if you had any insight at all, because I have zero. Do you have any insight at all as to why the birth rate is so low in this very otherwise dynamic economy?
Yes, and I think it parallels, you know, it's not the market causing the birth rate to go down. A lot of times when people attack the market, what I mean is voluntary exchange under the rule of law, and they blame it for these things. A lot of the debilitating effects, and this is the challenge that we have, and the challenge I think Christians have in morality, is they come from wealth. If you are successful, you get rich, and there's a lot of wealth, and then there are more temptations. There's temptations for security and all sorts of things. And I think a lot of people, you know, a lot of people weren't that wealthy before. They had a nice life, especially compared to China, and they, you know, it got very materialistic. You know, wealth. You know, they say, I want to have a bigger apartment and so forth. I mean, I think we see that here. How many families? You know, how many people here have the large families that they did? Our birth rate is a little bit disguised by immigration. So I think a lot of that. To me, that's the real Christian challenge on capitalism, and it's a challenge that all parents have. If you run a successful company, a family business, you pass it on. You don't want to spoil your children, and that, I mean, it's a classic long-term consideration. How do you keep them with the same values when they have more? They have more than you did. They're not as hungry and so forth, and that's the challenge. And just to be clear, I mean, I don't think Hong Kong is the the best place in the world or something. The question that I was trying to answer is, how do you help poor people get rich? How do you help poor people provide for themselves, live a life of dignity? Hong Kong is a success story. Hong Kong did that. It was a desperate little fishing village whose population doubled because of refugees, and it did it. It doesn't mean they do everything right. There's a lot of things they do wrong and so forth. And the birth rates, I think this is a problem in all. Look, it's the rising birth rates are generally a problem in rich societies. And Hong Kong is, like a lot of the other ones, a rich society now. Japan, I think, has an even lower birth rate. And I think that's that's one of the challenges of our churches, and it's very sad.
Father, right back here. There's a question here.
Yeah, I have a question. Kyung Lai from Singapore. Can you compare Hong Kong and Singapore? Hong Kong before 1997 is under the British rule colony, and I believe now Hong Kong is under China. And compare with Singapore, if you know Singapore, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew.
Yes, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and I had a lot of disagreements when I was editing out in
Okay.
Hong Kong, and he banned my newspaper. So.
Okay. And I will bring another country, Taiwan.
Right.
Now, Taiwan is very worried that China will, Taiwan will return to China.
Right.
And I'm a pastor. I'm serving also to the Taiwanese congregation.
Right.
They do not want Taiwan to go back to China, but they vote for the now President Ma Ying-jeou because of business, because of money. It's not all because of freedom or virtue. Can you comment on that? Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan.
Yeah. For the people that may not be familiar, they're all Chinese societies or Chinese-dominated societies. Singapore is closer to Hong Kong as a city-state. Singapore, though it achieved independence, still maintained the essence of British law and so forth, and did it very well. It's very successful. I think the general impression, and it's very clean, and if you go there and it's very honest, they have a good civil service. But the things that make Singapore work, I think, again, it's open to trade. When you're open to the world, when you open yourself to trade, you have to compete, and it can cover for a lot of other sins. And every day Lee Kuan Yew got up and said, we're too lazy, we got to do this. I mean, he's always telling the people, we can't get complacent, and they've done a pretty good job. Taiwan is sort of middle way between, a little larger, similar to the Hong Kong economy and different from Korea, and then its businesses are a lot of moms and pops, and they're worried. Taiwan might be the really interesting one because it was not under any British rule. It's evolved itself. From when I was out there, it was still a dictatorship, and now it's a free country. I don't think China is going to take over Taiwan. Taiwan's very successful. It's done what it's done in a very, very Chinese way. But again, you can look at the differences. What unites them all is that these are societies that trade. And when you trade, it means that your product has to be competitive elsewhere to trade because no one can force you. That forces a lot of discipline. It creates a lot of opportunities, and it forces a lot of discipline. So I think at bottom, what makes them successful is all very similar. Singapore has a much more active government, much more, public housing. The interesting thing is Singapore is much more interventionist in the economy than Hong Kong is. But when Hong Kong does it, it tends to be with a heavier hand. Singapore is actually, they have public housing, but they privatize the apartments. So there's a lot of differences, but I see them all as the same. These are market societies that open themselves up to trade, which means to international competition. It means that their entrepreneurs to succeed had to be as competitive as anyone in this room or anyone in other countries. And that's a really great discipline. I said before, competition in the market is not just against, it's for. So it means if a Taiwanese wants someone in France to buy their product, they have to be at a price that's competitive with a French manufacturer or an American manufacturer. The same holds if they're trying to sell in Egypt. And so I see a lot of similarities. I think it's, again, these are societies that gave people the economic freedom to build and trade, and they've done well. And the societies that have not done that have not done well.
Yes, I was wondering if you could just give us just a small picture, just a brief picture of what social welfare systems that Hong Kong might have in place. I don't know what that looks like, but do they have some systems in place, and how did they determine what was necessary in order to not create a welfare state?
Well, they have a lot of the same things that we have, and not all done perfectly, but in terms of the private institutions, they have sort of a midway model between, if you take schools, for example, those of us here, probably Father, we're all for vouchers to give parents, you know, the choice of where they want to go to school. In Hong Kong, they had all these refugees, and they needed the kids taught. They didn't give parents vouchers. They essentially gave religious groups vouchers. All the foreign missionaries, the Lutherans came in, the Catholics came in, and they said, if you set up a school and do this, we'll pay you. Now that's similar to what we do in a lot of cities. I'm not as familiar with Michigan, but I know last year I did a story on Chicago and Catholic charities, and it's amazing how many lives Catholic charities affects, and it gets a lot of money from government. But the reason it gets money from government, it's more efficient than government. So it's a catch-22 from a person who's a Catholic and believes in the integrity of our institutions. I'm skeptical of taking government money because it has a way of influencing what you do. From the perspective of a taxpayer, because Catholic charities, for example, in distributing food, they have 5 volunteers for every paid staffer. So you give them the money to buy food. These are people who really want to deliver the stuff are out there. You get a lot, the city gets a lot more bang for its buck. And that's one of the problems, you know, I didn't talk about it, but religious liberty. When we knock these people off the public square, whether it's the Boy Scouts and whether it's the Catholic Church and adoptions, we get someone that's doing it less efficiently for more money. And I think less humanely. Again, who would you rather have delivering your food if you're a shut-in in Chicago? Some volunteer from Catholic Charities or some government bureaucracy?
Really appreciate your talk very much. I'd like you to comment on what about 2 sentences ago. As I was sitting back there, I thought of the other ingredient of the 3 societies, and that was freedom of conscience and freedom of religion within ethical boundaries. If you could just comment on your observations of how important that area of freedom of conscience and religion is for this flourishing.
Yeah, I think that to me is part of the debate now over the contraceptive mandate and so forth. And one of the things I was particularly grateful for the bishops for doing was not trying to cut a deal and cut out the private businesses that are usually non-Catholics but low church denominations, or to just get the sort of institutional exception. You know, there was one of the things I saw in China. A lot of experts would go to China and they'd see a church, and you can go to Mass in China. I went to Mass, you know, many times in China, in the churches, and as reforms opened up, they got fuller. So you'd have people go and say, oh, religion's free. There are a bunch of people in church. But if you ask these people, do they have the freedom to run a clinic, to do what they do in Hong Kong, to run a clinic, to run a school, to teach catechism, to minister to other people? That's what separates the free society from the unfree. And freedom is rooted. It's important to have individual freedom to say what we want. It's vital. But that's not going to mean that much unless we have institutional freedom to come together and to say that collectively through our institutions. Because it's a lot easier for a government to crack down on individuals. And China, one of the differences, stark differences with Hong Kong and China, because of communism, you know, communism came in and destroyed all the kind of folk religions and all the institutions that existed before. And then now it has capitalism, but there's no roots. There's no institutions. And when they have a lot of brave individual dissidents, but they've generally not had a movement like Solidarity or Charter 77, because the Chinese have been very careful not to allow groups to come together. And our freedom is rooted in our ability not to just go to church and pray. That's the difference between freedom of worship and freedom of religion. Our freedom is to have an organization like the Acton Institute that can look at all these hundreds of people together, or that can run a hospital or do something. Not forcing anyone to go to the hospital, not forcing anyone to come here. And I think this is the battle royale here, this kind of understanding. And my fear is that we don't appreciate what we're losing until we've driven a lot of these groups off the public square.
Hi. So in the midst of a wonderful capitalist economy, Hong Kong has a mixed healthcare system. So almost 4 times as many public hospitals as private hospitals. And I was wondering if, being in Hong Kong, you've seen advantages of that, or if you think it needs to be further privatized?
Well, actually, it's a really interesting question. My friend in Hong Kong would tell you that the people used to build hospitals. Anyone ever see Love is a Many Splendor thing? Nancy Kwan, Will Holden. It's a hospital way up on the top, Matilda Hospital. Matilda was the name of the wife, I think, of a governor, and they built hospitals. Private people used to build hospitals. When the government takes over, private people stop building them. And I think Hong Kong has suffered a little because it's gone more to the public area. Their healthcare their system is better than ours. When I was there with my kids, to go to a pediatrician, it was $15 or something. It was very cheap. Because they still had a pricing mechanism. Ironically, someone mentioned Singapore. Singapore has an excellent healthcare system, and part of it is that it's much more market-oriented. And that means they give you a lot more, even though they control things, they guarantee everyone gets coverage, they've done it in a much more market-friendly way. For example, if you go for an operation, you can choose to stay in a hospital that's like a 5-star hotel. Might have a room for your family member next door, and really like a hotel in luxury. Or you can choose like a dormitory, almost with no air conditioning and so forth. It's clean. And Singapore's system is in many ways better than ours, in terms of cleanliness and so forth. It's not a third world system. So I think we can learn. Even when we intervene, Hong Kong intervened a lot. Cowperthwaite had to intervene. I think you want to intervene in the smartest, most market-friendly way, because there are always, the unanticipated consequences, the unintended consequences of intervening in the heavy-handed way. So there are a lot of lessons out there, and I would take Hong Kong's system over Obamacare any day. And they've gone too public. They should go back.
Take one last question right here.
Traverse City, Michigan.
Could you take the microphone?
Oh, thank you. Anyway, I visited Hong Kong in the early 90s, and the thing that impressed me or struck me was that every square inch of sidewalk space, somebody is selling something.
Right.
It doesn't matter what it is, but he's got something for sale, he's going to make a buck.
It really, apart from being a success, when I went to Hong Kong, I had all these impressions of a dog-eat-dog society, and of course Hong Kong people were donating to their villages in China and stuff. It was a very gentle society in a lot of ways, and it was a great society, and it was a home for people that couldn't be free. I'll end with this. A friend of mine who was Chinese, who's I think since died, his father was a newspaper man in Shanghai. I know there's some people from Shanghai. And in the Civil War, he covered Chiang Kai-shek taking some of the gold to Taiwan. He was a nationalist, but he didn't like the corruption that he saw with Chiang Kai-shek and stuff. So he was stuck, and he didn't want to go to Hong Kong because, as a Chinese nationalist, he felt it was humiliating to have to go and be freer under British colonial rule than under rule by Chinese people. And he later told me something. There are 2 quotes on this. He said, Hong Kong, in its short period of life, 150 years, he died in, I think, the 80s or the 90s, delivered what no Chinese society had ever delivered before: freedom from the midnight knock on the door. That's a powerful statement. And Sun Yat-sen said more or less the same thing. How is it that the British accomplished this? Well, the answer is freedom. And that's why you're here. That's why the Acton Institute does such good work. And thank you for coming. And again, thank you for listening.